Alright, so this video is about making ginger beer. Now, in this one, my audio microphone wasn't working very well when I recorded it, so I'm doing this as a voiceover. So, start with, we'll have a think about what we need for this. So, ginger beer is made from ginger, sugar, lemon juice, and so on, and the process is helped by yeast. I'm going to use two large plastic bottles. You could use a plastic jug. I've got also, if I wanted to do a large amount, 15 or 20 litres, a bucket is quite useful. This is a brewing bucket I keep especially for that sort of purpose. Nice and clean. If you're going to use a bucket, make sure that it's a nice clean bucket and hasn't been used for anything toxic. What ingredients do we need? So let's see, we need some root ginger, which we're going to grate up. I'm going to show you some tricks about how to do that. You need a reasonable amount for this. We're going to need half a cup for the quantity I'm going to make of about 4 litres. We need some lemon juice. We're going to use one tablespoon rather per litre. We've got some yeast. We're going to use about half a teaspoon per litre. It's active yeast. We're going to use sugar. We're going to use about 70 grams of sugar per litre. So these two bottles, they're about 2 litres each. The first step in the process we're going to make is to sterilize these bottles. Now obviously these are made of plastic. We can't put those in the oven to sterilize them, so we're going to need a different approach. Alright, so one option I would have to sterilize these bottles is using this no-rinse sterilizer that I've got from a brewing shop. The no-rinse sterilizer has a chemical in it called sodium percarbonate, which is also known as oxygen bleach. You might have this around the house either because one of your parents is into brewing, or also oxygen bleach can be used in your laundry and for various outdoor chores like killing the molds and funguses that grow on your deck. But if you decide to use a chemical sterilizer, make sure that you know exactly what it is and how to use it. What I'm going to use is boiling water, so I'm going to pour some boiling water into the bottle and swish it around a bit, being careful not to close the bottle too much or it might come shooting out. So put some really hot water in there, kind of just move it around, swish it around a bit, try and get all of the surfaces of the bottle covered with some very high temperature water, and then I'm going to tip it out and do that process again with the other bottle and with this bottle a couple more times. Alright. Okay, so now I've sterilized my 2 bottles. I need to start this process by grating some ginger. So here's my first little trick. When we go to grate the ginger, I'm going to use a teaspoon to scrape the outer skin off. And then I'm going to use a knife. First I'm going to cut the ends of the ginger off. Then I'm going to use a teaspoon to scrape the skin off the outside. And that will prepare it for the grating. Scrape, 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 scrape. Here's the grater. So grate, grate, grate. See how it goes. Grate, 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 grate. Now the ginger is really just a flavour in the ginger beer. It's not something that is going to interact in any great way with our yeast. The yeast isn't going to be in the ginger beer to produce the bubbles in the ginger beer by consuming the sugar that we've put in. It might have some impact on, or the enzymes from the yeast might have some impact on the ginger, but mostly the ginger is there to provide a flavouring. So we're going to grate it up, and that's going to allow the juice from the ginger to really get into the beer. It should make quite a ginger beer with quite a nice bite to it. Let's see if it fits in my measuring cup. There we go. Right on half a cup of ginger. tucked in there behind the grater so you can't see it. There it is, half a cup of ginger. Alright, so now we have our ginger ready, so I'm going to pack this ginger into these 2 bottles, about half in each bottle. It's a bit messy, but I could try and push it through a funnel, but the funnel would be quite narrow and probably get stuck, so I'll just push it in here using my fingers. I'll tidy up the stove or the bench top afterwards. So there's no real trouble if it makes a bit of a mess. Pop it in there. Okay, once I've got the ginger into the bottles, the next step is going to be putting in the other main ingredients, and we're going to start with the lemon juice. So we need about a tablespoon of lemon juice into each of these bottles. Find the tablespoon. Okay, tablespoon of lemon juice per bottle. I'm using lemon juice out of a bottle because I don't have any lemons on my trees at the moment. Lemons just seem to be out of season in my garden. If I did, I'd use fresh lemons, would be preferable. Okay, the other major ingredient here, this is the one that is super necessary because it provides the food for the yeast to make a nice carbonated drink. I'm just going to use this as just standard sugar. I've got some just standard white sugar. I've also got some raw sugar because my white sugar is going to run out. It doesn't really matter which one you use. They have essentially the same effect, providing the food for the yeast and providing sweetness for the drink when it's ready. Now we're going to put enough sugar in that probably the yeast will use most of it up in the brewing process, and we should get quite a dry drink out of the other end. Okay, so I've got the bottle sitting on some scales so that I can measure the right amount of sugar out. I'm putting about 65 grams of sugar per litre, so about 130 grams of sugar into each one of these 2-litre bottles. They're actually, I think, just over 2-litre bottles, but I'm deliberately going to be leaving an air gap at the top because when the yeast starts going to work, it will produce quite a large amount of gas and bubbles, and I want to have some headspace for that at the top of the bottle. It's getting stuck in the funnel, so just shake it through. Alright, back after completing that for both bottles now, I'm just filling up a kettle with some water, and this is so that I can heat it up and get it to boiling. What I want to do is add boiling water to each of the 2 bottles. We're going to do about 1/3 of the water as boiling water and the rest of the water is cold water, and that will give me a temperature that's about right for my yeast when I want to put it in, but also it will mean that the high temperature water is good for dissolving the sugar. So here we go. I'm going to put about 500 milliliters of water, which is about 500 grams in here. In this case, my kettle holds about 1.2 litres, so I'm going to put about half into each of the 2 bottles. And judge it not too carefully and just kind of go from one to the other and hope that they end up about even. Now, if you are using plastic bottles and you're using boiling water into them, be aware that some types of plastic bottle will actually shrink, like plastic milk bottles that you might get your milk in might shrink from the very hot water, whereas these old juice bottles are quite capable of coping with this temperature. Alright, so getting them close to even. Now obviously if I was to put the yeast in now when it was, or if I'd already put the yeast in, and then I put the boiling water in, I put the yeast into the boiling water, then my yeast, which is a living organism, would die, the same as I used the boiling water to prepare the bottles in the first place. So I can't put the yeast in when it's at this high temperature, but this is a good temperature for dissolving the sugar. If I want to put the yeast in, I need to bring the temperature down, and to do that I'm going to add additional cold water to each bottle to fill it up, more or less to the top, not quite to the top. Alright, now having sloshed this around enough to dissolve the sugar, I'm taking the bottle around to the sink and filling it up with cold water nearly to the top. I'll repeat that process with the other bottle. I'm feeling it now. It's just gone down to a nice warm temperature, not too hot, not too cold. Not as hot as the yogurt. If you watch the yogurt making video, it's sort of more or less a feeling like a lukewarm temperature. Yeast is good. Yeast works well. Temperatures up to about 30 degrees, but beyond that, it can get it can die off. So you don't want to have too much temperature with the yeast. There we go. 2 bottles, nice warm temperature, ready to go. All we need now is some lids on the top. We're going to put some lids on, not too tight. It's not true. What I need next is, of course, the yeast. Duh. So these are going to take 1 teaspoon of yeast per 2-litre bottle. I've got a half teaspoon measuring spoon, so I'm going to put 2 of those in each bottle. Now this is active yeast granules. This is not the yeast you might have with a bread maker, which would be some people use in their bread maker. Some people would use yeast that's marked as sure bake yeast that has some additives that are good for making bread. So you don't want that because you're not making bread. Here you want active yeast granules. Sometimes they come in envelope-shaped packets. You can actually make your own yeast using a kind of a natural process. There's yeast cells out there in our environment all the time. A really good source of yeast cells for that would be on something like dried fruit. You put some dried fruit in a glass of water and leave it there for a few hours, and you'll start to see the water go sort of cloudy, and that's your yeast getting underway. They'll start using some of the sugars from the fruit and breeding themselves up, and then you can use that as the basis for this. Because of course it doesn't matter, you don't need that much yeast in your ginger beer because it's going to breed and multiply. So just putting the tops on these bottles now. I'm going to leave those tops just slightly loose. I want I want to be able to mix it up, but I also want, initially at least, but then I also want the carbon dioxide to be able to escape. The yeast cells are going to release enzymes in here. They're going to break the sugar down. The glucose is going to be absorbed into the yeast cells. The yeast cells are going to use the glucose in their respiration process. That respiration process is going to produce lots of carbon dioxide, which is going to be great because that's what's going to make our beverage all carbonated and fizzy. As well as that, the yeast is going to reduce the level of sugar in the drink and make it a drier kind of ginger beer. The yeast cells, of course, with plenty of energy and a nice warm temperature and this moist environment, i.e. being in the liquid, they're going to have enough energy to grow really rapidly. When they get large enough, they will start the process of reproduction as well, which is called budding in yeast. They'll multiply their genetic material, and then keep in mind here, yeast have a nucleus in their cell. They're a fungi, not a bacteria. So they have a nucleus. So in the nucleus, that genetic material will be duplicated. It will become the nucleus will move to one edge of the cell, where a new kind of cell bud will be starting to appear off the outside. That bud will eventually develop in almost like a little sort of mini football off the side of the cell. The nucleus moves into the area where the bud and the cell join. Then at a certain point in this process, the bud completes its formation. The nucleus and the cell divide simultaneously so that a new small cell is formed that includes a small nucleus with all the genetic material, a copy of the genetic material in it. The original cell is much larger than the new budded cell, but this new budded cell can then proceed to grow and eventually be able to replicate itself as well. Meanwhile, the original cell, also having grown a little bit further, will go through this budding process again. So just like with bacteria, your yeast will go through a reproductive process that can lead to very high amounts of growth in very short amounts of time if the conditions are appropriate. But it's not binary fission, instead it's a process called budding. Okay, so this ginger beer, I'm going to put it away on a tray, but just in case it overflows, I'm going to put it away for a couple of days. It should be ready to drink in about 2 days, at which point I will start storing it in the refrigerator. I hope your experiments with ginger beer are as successful as I hope mine are likely to be. Now here we are after an hour. Um, I can see that it's started to foam on the top. It's got a nice yeasty smell. It's not really got going in any great way yet though. I'll have another look at it in a day or two. So here's the ginger beer the next day. You can see it's gone cloudy, which is thousands of tiny little bubbles rising to the surface, which is the carbon dioxide being produced by the yeast. Looks like it'll be good to put in the fridge tomorrow.